On today's Locked On Jayhawks, Jalon Daniels comes in ranked 4th in the Locked On preseason Big 12 quarterback rankings. I'm going to tell you why that's too low. They be sleeping on Jalen. We're discussing that on today's edition of the show.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Derek Johnson, Monday through Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. on KLWN in Lawrence with Rock Chalk Sports Talk. Thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. Thank you to all the everydayers out there who listen to all our shows. We are free and available wherever you get any of your podcasts. You can also like and subscribe to the show and find us on our YouTube page, again, with Locked On Jayhawks. On today's edition of the show, I'm excited for this one. We went over some of the preseason poll stuff that the Locked On Big 12 members voted on and put a poll together. Today, we're discussing the quarterback rankings that came out. Jalon Daniels is at number 4, which, yes, being ranked 4 of the 14 quarterbacks, yeah, sure. Overall, that's a good thing. It's underrated, though. It's underrated, and we're going to talk about why. And, it's not something to be, like, angry about, like splitting hairs between 1, 2, 3, and 4. Probably not much, but Jalon Daniels, to me, definitely needs to be higher than number 4 on the list. We're also going to talk about where would Jason Bean rank if you were eligible for this list kind of individually, and just overall the thoughts on the rankings. Is anybody too high, too low? Is anybody a sleeper around the rest of the Big 12? All right, so the Big 12 quarterback rankings suss out like this. Dillon Gabriel comes in at number 1, the Oklahoma quarterback, transferred in from UCF. This will be year 2 for him in the program. Obviously, KU fans saw him kind of tear apart the defense in that game in Norman in the middle of the season. Quinn Ewers comes in at number 2. He might be the highest pro prospect of the group because he's got the size, the big arm, former highly regarded recruit. Part of this ranking is based on potential, the idea that he was this former highly rated recruit and that he is a possible first-round pick, that he does have the size that, if it comes together in year 2 of the Steve Sarkisian offense, there's going to be a lot of potential there with a lot of good weapons. Number 3 is Will Howard. He was awesome for Kansas State. I mean, it's funny. Will Howard is a true freshman for Kansas State. So you didn't know what you were going to get from him when he had to come in for Adrian Martinez when he got hurt last year. And he ended up probably being better. Ended up starting the Sugar Bowl for them, Big 12 championship. He was a really good player. So definitely understand him being in the top 5 here. Jalon Daniels in at number 4, which in a moment we're going to tell you why he should be higher than that. John Reese Plumlee, the quarterback at UCF. He's obviously a newcomer since UCF is just a newcomer as a team, but he had a really solid dual threat season last year for Gus Malzahn and his offense. Further down the list, if you're watching on YouTube, we only have the graphic for the top 5, but number 6 is Texas Tech. So either Baron Morton or Tyler Shuck. We'll see who starts. Tyler Shuck obviously had a really good game against Kansas. Baron Morton, former highly regarded recruit. Blake Shapen, Sawyer Robertson at Baylor. They come in at number 7. Just confidence that Baylor will figure it out. Donovan Smith at Houston comes in at number 8. Now he goes to Houston. Chance Nolan, Chandler Morris, Josh Hoover. Whoever wins that battle for TCU. Nolan is a transfer from Morgan State. Morris was actually the starter to open the year over Max Duggan. They're in below that. Then to number 10, you get to Keaton Slovis at BYU, who transferred in from Pitt. Prior to that was at USC, and I don't know, was he at Ole Miss? I can't remember. Hunter Deckers at Iowa State is 11. Emory Jones at Cincinnati, transfer from Arizona State. Before that, Florida is in at number 12. And then the Oklahoma State quarterback situation of Alan Bowman / Garrett Rangel / Gunnar Gundy is in at number 13, with the last place quarterback situation, whoever wins the battle between Garrett Green and Nico Marchiol at West Virginia. Don't know if I'm pronouncing that wrong. All right, but why is Jalon Daniels in at number 4? So first of all, we know what Jalon Daniels did, and very respectable to be in the top 5, right? At the end of the day, you did have an injury. But I find it very interesting. Jalon Daniels was literally voted second team All Big 12 last year. Okay? So he goes from second team All Big 12 last year to coming back, and it's like, no, we're going to bump him lower. Now, obviously, the Locked On poll is different than the people who vote on, the awards at the end of the season in the Big 12, whether it's the AP or the coaches. But he came in second team there, so he comes in fourth team here. And that was with him playing 7.5 season games, right? He technically played 9 games over the course of the season. He had the bowl game. The TCU game counts as a full game. But really, he only played, by the time that award came out, 7.5 regular season games. the coaches were that impressed with him and what he did to get all Big 12 second team. Now, does and should past injuries matter into this ranking? Did other Locked On Big 12 hosts factor that in and go, well, he had those injuries last year and that does matter. And, he had injuries the year before that kept him out of fall camp that led to Jason Bean winning the job. And he had injuries his true freshman season when the offensive line for Kansas really struggled and he was getting beat up as a 17-year-old at the time. Does that matter into this ranking? I don't know. I do understand if you phrase it this way. Like if you said you have 8 games of Jalon Daniels versus 12 games of Quinn Ewers, that would mean in theory, you need Jalon Daniels to be more than 150% better than Quinn Ewers to make up for those lost 4 games. So I understand the math part of that. I understand the injury part of that, but I don't know for these types of rankings if that should be considered or if it even was considered for other people. If we're just going based on what you could bring to the table in a one sample size or how talented you are, how good of a player you are, I think Jalon Daniels should be ahead there. I don't know, man. I think that if Jalon Daniels was wearing an Oklahoma or a Texas uniform, he's probably number 1 on this list. And I actually went through and I compiled some data. I'm going to show this on our YouTube. Of course, if you're listening on our audio side, I'll try to explain this as I best can. I'm also going to tweet out. You can find me at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. It is a list of the quarterback rankings that we have with Locked On Big 12 for a quarterback, and then it shows you their pass yards per game, their completion percentage, yards per attempt, all these different stats that show who the best quarterbacks are. And we have little hide areas of who is first, second, and third in all these different categories. And you look at the stats for Jalon Daniels. Now, obviously, there's different game amounts. Some guys like Dylan Gabriel missed some action. Quinn Ewers missed some action. Will Howard wasn't the starter all the way through. Jalon Daniels missed some action, right? So instead of just going on total stats, these are all per game averages, touchdowns per game, yards per game, yards per attempt, QBR, which is just like an efficiency metric, right? And you look at that across the board. Jalon Daniels is, I believe, 4th in passing yards per game of all the quarterbacks competing here that we mentioned as part of the rankings. He is 1st in completion percentage. There were actually 2 other quarterbacks with 66.1 completion percentage, but if you keep going further down the line of the decimals, he slightly edges them out. I didn't count guys who have only thrown like 20 passes for what it's worth. Yards per attempt, Jalon Daniels also 1st. You look at the interceptions per game, he was all 1st. Passing touchdowns per game, he was 3rd. Rushing yards per game, he was to just John Reese Plumlee. Rushing touchdowns per game, he was 2nd. Total yards per game, he was 2nd to just Dylan Gabriel, who's 1st. Total touchdowns per game, Jalon Daniels was 1st. Total QBR on ESPN, he was 1st. Not just in the Big 12, but he was 1st in the entire country last year in total QBR. So you look at this across the board, and you're like, why is Jalon Daniels only number 4? Like, should he be ahead of Will Howard? Should he be ahead of Quinn Ewers? Honestly, I get the potential. I get the stuff with Quinn Ewers, but until he proves it to me, I'd probably have a top 3 in some order of Dylan Gabriel, Will Howard, and Jalon Daniels. And then I might have Quinn Ewers number 4 to go with that possibly potential. But with Jalon, you just look at the numbers base of this. He should be that number 1 guy. Like even compares favorably to Dylan Gabriel, the number 1 guy. And again, going back to the idea, if you were to put Jalon Daniels in the Oklahoma offense with an Oklahoma uniform, I think he is the number 1 quarterback on this list. So for my money, in my mind, Jalon Daniels is the best quarterback in the Big 12. The big question becomes, will he stay healthy? And I mean, if you look at it, including the bowl game, so if we go off, Jalon Daniels played 8.5 games last year. If you were to pace out what he did in the 8.5 games into a 12-game regular season, here's the numbers he would have put up. 3,435 total yards, 35 total touchdowns to 6 interceptions, number 1 in QBR in the Big 12 and in the country. That's really darn good. So to me, Jalon Daniels has the potential to be the number 1 quarterback in the Big 12, and he might already be there. But what's cool about this is I think the floor here, it almost feels like they're a pretty, like, to me, it does feel like you could argue that all these top 4 guys are in tier 1 of the Big 12. And then maybe like John Reese Plumlee would be in tier 2 all by himself. And then you'd have like tier 3, some guys like competing. I don't know. So maybe the floor here is being the number 4 quarterback in the Big 12, being the number 5 quarterback in the Big 12. But I think you could make the real argument he is number 1. The real floor here just comes with injury. And I think what else is funny, as we were going over yesterday, the picks of where everybody is. Kansas was picked 9th. The teams who were picked 1, 2, and 3 in some order: Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas State. Guess what? The top 3 quarterbacks in the league are from those schools. Jalon Daniels, number 4. Kansas is number 9. So this goes back to the idea that, there are only 3 other Big 12 teams besides Kansas to return their quarterback, their head coach, their offensive coordinator, their defensive coordinator. It's those 3 at the top, and then it's Kansas. That's meant a lot for the other teams. Hasn't meant as much for Kansas in a boost. I'm telling you, as a full season, you're going to be looking at him as either number 1 or number 2 on this list by the end of the year. All right, let's continue on with some of this talk about the quarterback rankings in just a second. I'm interested in the conversation of, where would Jason Bean rank? Because Jason Bean was really good as a backup for KU. If hypothetically it was a world where Jason Bean was the starting quarterback, or, if there is an injury, where would he rank in this list? First, though, this episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. You can bet on any of their great promos or boosts. You can bet on people to hit a home run. You can do a same-game parlay. They got all sorts of action, and it's not just baseball. They've got everything else going on right now. You want to bet on the match with, well, I guess that happened yesterday because I'm recording this on Thursday. So bet on anything you want with FanDuel. You want to bet on some of the golf action going on over the weekend? I've been loving doing that and, getting live odds on top 5, top 10s. Don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission. All right, so on to the question here. Where would Jason Bean rank if he were eligible for this list, right? And if you were just doing, like, let's say we did every quarterback on the 2 deep for every team or something in the Big 12, where would he rank on this list? I think very clearly to me, like, it's hard with Jalon Daniels being number 4 to be like, oh, he'd be a top 5 guy, because it makes it feel like there's not as much separation there. And maybe there's not. I think we saw when Jason Bean was in the game last year, he was a more than viable backup, maybe the best backup in the entire country. He could be a really good starter at a lot of other schools. And there were a lot of great things he did. But there was still a separation between what Jason Bean brought versus Jalon Daniels. Jalon being a better runner, gives you more in the option game, more decisive decisions, more consistency with Jalon as opposed to Jason Bean. And so there was a sizable gap there in what the two guys kind of brought to the table. So it's hard to be like, oh, well, he'd be number 5. And, but I do think there are some comparisons. If you look at John Reese Plumlee, not a ton of great passing numbers, a good runner, good dual threat. Jason Bean has just as much speed as anybody. I mean, he's arguably the fastest player on the team, but he doesn't run with the same tenacity. But if we look at Jason Bean's numbers, they're actually pretty ridiculous when I went through this exercise. Jason Bean had an 82.8 QBR last season. So that Jalon Daniels ranks number 1 there. Number 2 would have been Jason Bean. Then number 3, Will Howard, if he would have qualified here, right? So, I mean, on its own, you could argue that he should be top 5 off that. Max Duggan, for what it's worth, was second behind Jalon for qualified guys at 80.2. So Bean was even ahead of him. And Bean was essentially the starter for 4.5 games, right? He started 4 games, and then he started the second half of the TCU game when Jalon gets injured at the end of the first half. So if you prorate his stats, 4.5 games into a 12-game season, these are the numbers that Jason Bean would have put up. 3,400 passing yards, almost 600 rushing yards, 37 passing touchdowns to 11 interceptions, and 11 rushing touchdowns. So basically, if you prorate what Jason Bean did in 4.5 games to a 12-game regular season, he would have put up about 4,000 total yards and 48 total touchdowns. Is this guy like Tim Tebow and Cam Newton? Like, that is incredible numbers for Jason Bean. This is your backup quarterback. And if those were the numbers, we'd probably be looking at that guy coming back being like he's the number 1 or number 2 quarterback returning in the Big 12. At the very least, he'd be where Jalon is as a top 4, top 5 guy. Now, again, would that pace have sustained? It's only 4.5 games, right? Would that have sustained over 12 games? Probably not. Is part of those insane numbers KU just being down? Like you get down 28-3 to Baylor. Of course, you're going to have to throw a bunch. You get down, or really the whole game against OU, you're down between, 7 and 21 points, and you're constantly having to catch up with quick scores. So, like, yes, that is part of Jalon Daniels. Maybe you're in better position because of how you play early in the game to maintain a lead, and some of the total numbers don't end up the same there. And Bean had some of those deficiencies that, like I said, there still was a jump to what Jalon Daniels provided there. So if I take all that into account, though, with the stats, the way Dylan Gabriel, Quinn Ewers, Will Howard, Jalon Daniels, those are your top 4 quarterbacks. Those are the tier 1 quarterbacks to me in the Big 12. Again, I would put Jalon Daniels at number 1. You could argue Jason Bean could go in that tier 1 of quarterbacks. At the very least, to me, I'd probably, you put Jason Bean in tier 2 with John Reese Plumlee. Maybe you're high on what the Texas Tech guys can do because, we did see Tyler Shuck play really well against Kansas. I know Baron Morton has really high potential. Like, it wouldn't shock me if either of those guys ended up being to this potential, this year. So if you want to put those guys in tier 2, Blake Shapen kind of had an up and down season, but I was impressed from some of the stuff I saw. Like, if you want to put him up there, whatever. But that's kind of what you're getting here. You could realistically say and make a real argument that Kansas has the best quarterback in the conference, and they have 2 top 5 quarterbacks in the conference. And that seems a little crazy and insane, but it might just not be when you look at the numbers. And that's going to be super important for a team that does run the speed option. And Jalon Daniels has gotten injured each of his last 3 seasons to at least, varying degrees. Even some might be minor versus some more real type stuff. It's good to have that backup like Jason Bean that you can count on and trust. And even if there is, a drop off a little bit in the level of play, you feel like you're still getting somebody who is going to be good enough to win you games and be a better quarterback than other quarterbacks in the conference, which not a lot of other schools can have. There are a lot of schools that, your starting quarterback goes down and then it is just absolute mayhem. And Kansas, very fortunate Jason Bean decided to come back for another year in Lawrence. Up here with Locked On Jayhawks, I want to talk about who's too high, who's too low on this list overall, just around the Big 12 outside of the Kansas guys. You're listening to Locked On Jayhawks. So who's too high, who's too high, who's too low on the quarterback rankings, the top 14 in the conference? Well, I think that I've kind of already talked about that. I thought Quinn Ewers might be a hair too high. I would probably have him closer to number 4, but I get the pro potential. And if it does hit, it's going to look really good because you have a good offensive coordinator in your head coach with Steve Sarkisian. You got great talent around you, and you have all the physical tools in the world to succeed. So if it does hit, Quinn Ewers could end up being the number 1 quarterback in the conference by the end of the year. That would not be shocking. Just based on the evidence we have right now, that's why I would put him maybe in at, a lot, like number 4, for instance. I think if you go down the list, I could see a world where the winner of the Tech quarterback competition ends up being a top 5 quarterback, even though it's not like that big of a jump into the top 5 there. I think that the TCU quarterback is probably being underrated here. I think part of it is because you don't know who it's going to be, and that automatically makes you think, oh, there's quarterback controversy. Chandler Morris was the starting quarterback ahead of Max Duggan to start the year. And I know TCU fans are playing that ad nauseum, and I get it. There is a difference between practice quarterbacks and in-game quarterbacks. Todd Reesing, we used to hear all the time about him being a bad practice player because sometimes he would just test to see what he could get away with and then reel in things for the game. I think to a certain extent, like we've heard some things about Jalon Daniels that, sometimes he might get a little pick happy in practice that he's just testing things, but then come the regular season, he was number 1 in the Big 12 last year in interceptions per game, right? So like you test what you can get away with in practice. That's what practice is supposed to be for, right? You're practicing things and seeing what you can do, and then you tighten the screws on game day. Does that make sense? So there's a chance that Max Duggan maybe he was more of a gamer than Chandler Morris, but that does give you hope if you're TCU. Now it could be Chance Nolan, who actually, he had a good QBR, 72 at Oregon State a year before. I think TCU will move up into the top half of the quarterback rankings when things are all said and done here. Keaton Slovis is an interesting case because not a great year at Pitt, but he did have some really good statistic years at USC. I think BYU will make it easier on him with having this run offense and having, I think, a really good coached and disciplined team and physical team that he's going to do a lot of play action. Wouldn't be surprised if he moves up in the rankings there. And I guess Alan Bowman to me is the ultimate big variability here because with Oklahoma State, when Spencer Sanders went down, Rangel and Gundy really struggled. But Bowman comes over. He had some years at Texas Tech where he was pretty good when he was on the field, but kept getting injured. Goes to Michigan last year, only plays in a few games, and now he's possibly going to play again. If we see the good Alan Bowman that we saw at Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Mike Gundy's been such a great coach that you almost trust them to just figure it out. But, then again, you could see that being the worst situation in the Big 12. Garrett Green had a great QBR, so maybe he's being rated too low here, though he's kind of a dual threat. That'll be interesting to see how they kind of use things there. But yeah, if you're asking me who has the highest potential in the bottom half quarterbacks to skyrocket up the rankings, I'd probably go to whoever wins the TCU job. I mean, you also add to it that Sonny Dykes, like that offense, they're just going to put up numbers, big totals for the quarterbacks, and Keaton Slovis for BYU. All right, that is the quarterback rank Locked On Big 12 side of things. We have some more polls, like who are the best offenses, who are the best defenses. We're going to get to those throughout the summer here on Locked On Jayhawks. Don't forget to subscribe to the show if you're listening anywhere you get any of your podcasts. It's a 5-star review if your platform allows it. If you could, helps us out. If you're watching or listening on YouTube, give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to the show there as well. And I'll post the whole graphic with how all the quarterbacks have done statistically from last year on my Twitter account, which you can give me a follow at DJohnsonRadio. Have a good rest of your day. See you next time for another edition of Locked On Jayhawks. Have a good weekend. Later.